It says we are live. We're two Bennetts, but we're not related to each other. I should find out. Well, actually, go ahead and tell us who you are, and tell us a little bit about. You've got a podcast, and you've been a congressional candidate, and all that. Give people who don't listen to your podcast an introduction for people on my podcast.
Sure. My name is Jim Bennett. We tried to figure out if we were related somewhere back in the.
Where are your Bennetts from? Mine are from Pennsylvania and Philadelphia area.
Yeah, mine joined the church in Birmingham, England 4 or 5 generations ago, and then came to Utah. So they haven't
we might be related. We just don't know.
We just don't know. My Bennett. So Richard Bennett was the first Bennett to come to Utah. He never joined the church. He was married to a woman named Mariah Foster, and all of the Fosters joined the church. And Richard Bennett said, okay, I'll go to Utah on one condition. We have enough money to come back when you come to your senses. And so they went to Utah, and there was a fire, and the money all burned up. And Richard Bennett went to Brigham Young and said, we need help. All our money burned up in a fire.
There's a Richard Bennett that knew Brigham Young? Wow.
This is back in the 1850s, I think. Yeah, I'm not sure, but so Richard Bennett goes to Brigham Young and says, all our money burned up in a fire and we need the church's help. And Brigham Young said, you're not a member of the church. I'm not going to help you at all. And that really upset him, and his wife and their whole family had joined, and Brigham Young assigned the Fosters to go settle Bear Lake. And Richard Bennett said, forget it. You wouldn't help us, I'm not going to help you. And so the Bennetts stayed in Salt Lake. So the only reason my strain of Bennetts are from Salt Lake is because Richard Bennett told Brigham Young to stick it. And my great-grandfather, so Richard Bennett would have been my great-great-grandfather, and my great-grandfather was a man named John F. Bennett. And when he was about 10, he went to stay with his relatives in Bear Lake for a summer, and they start talking about the church, and they find out he hasn't been baptized, and they freak out that he hasn't been baptized. And so they baptize him, and he comes back to Salt Lake, and Richard Bennett says to him, well, if you're a member, you're going to go. And so my great-grandfather was the only Bennett. My grandfather used to say that John F. Bennett was the only member of that family that was worth the price of a bullet. Says the others weren't worth shooting. And John F. Bennett, he founded the Bennett Glass and Paint Company.
I was going to ask you about that. I remember that.
Yeah, that was John F. Bennett who founded that, and then my grandfather ran that, and then my uncle ran it. That went bankrupt in the mid-'80s. But John F. Bennett was the president of the Sunday School for years. Back then, before correlation, Sunday School was its sort of own autonomous organization. Yeah. And John F. Bennett, they would come to him and say, well, we want to do this program and that program. Can we afford it? And he'd say, oh, well, let me look. Okay, yeah, I think we can find the money for that. And after he died, they opened his books and discovered that he had personally been subsidizing the Sunday school organization out of his own pocket so that they could do all of these funky little projects. So he died long before I was born, so I never knew him. He died when my father was about 6, and he doesn't have very many memories of him either. But those are my Bennetts.
And you have a famous father and wasn't Wallace Bennett part of your family?
Wallace Bennett is my grandfather.
Yeah, and he was a senator from Utah, right?
A senator. He was elected in 1950. He served until 1976.
Okay.
And
did Orrin Hatch defeat him?
I'm sorry?
Did Orrin Hatch defeat him?
No.
Okay.
Orrin Hatch defeated Frank Moss.
Okay.
Who was a Democrat. Wallace Bennett was the first Republican to win statewide office in 20 years when he was elected in 1950. Utah was a solidly Democratic state up until then. And he was the first Republican to win. And he and Frank Moss did not get along. And my father remembered asking him, so is Frank Moss, the Democratic senator from Utah, is Frank Moss the dumbest senator in the Senate? And my grandfather thought for a minute and said, no, there's always McGovern. So, yeah, he retired in 1976. I was 8 years old. I don't remember him as a senator. I remember him post-Senate. He went and lived up in Emigrate, and we would have these big family gatherings up at his condo every Sunday evening. So, but yeah, and my father was elected in 1992, and he served until 2010. I ran his final campaign, and I had, just by way of background, professionally or personally for me, everybody sort of assumes, because I'm a Bennett, that I grew up in Utah and in Salt Lake City, and I actually didn't. I grew up in Southern California. My father's career was really kind of wild and dangerous, and at one point he was suspected of being deep throat in the Watergate scandal.
Oh, I remember that.
I always wanted to write a book called My Father Deep Throat, and the more he would deny it, the more books I would have sold. But he now that we know who Deep Throat was, it's not nearly as exciting. But when Watergate happened, it destroyed my father's career in Washington. I was actually born in the District of Columbia.
Oh.
One of my early memories is sitting on the moving boxes in our house in Arlington, Virginia, as I watched Richard Nixon resign on television. And we moved to Southern California when I was 6 years old, and I went through 1st through 12th grade in Southern California, and then went to college at the University of Southern California. So I did not grow up in Utah. I grew up outside of all of this, and I was going to be a world famous actor. I was actually a theater major, and I ended up running a theater in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, for a number of years, and I went back to school because I realized that my theater degree was essentially qualifying me to work at some of your finer fast food restaurants. And I went and got a business degree. I got an MBA from BYU and sort of got into theater management. I was hired down at Tuacahn in southern Utah. I worked down there for 5 years. And then the president of Tuacahn was a guy named Fred Lampropoulos.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember Fred?
I
Fred's
do.
still around. But Fred,
I remember hearing him on the radio.
Yeah, well, I wrote all of those.
Oh.
He did these 2-minute. It's very expensive to do a 2-minute radio ad, but he did a daily 2-minute radio ad to sort of introduce himself to the Utah electorate, and he hired me to write those for him. And so he'd do these. This is Fred Lampropoulos. Here's something I thought you might like to know. And he did that without actually declaring his candidacy. So anyway, I ended up being sort of the communications director for that campaign. That was in 2004, and he came in third in the convention behind John Huntsman and Nolan Karras, and so he was knocked out of that. But then that sort of introduced me into the world of political campaigns, and I started running campaigns for state legislators. I ran campaign for Ellis Ivory, Salt Lake County mayor. And just I started sort of making my living as a Republican hack, is the way I describe it. And then I was hired to run my father's campaign in 2010, and he lost. And again, I haven't felt a day's worth of guilt because I said to him, Dad, if you don't disavow your immigration position and your TARP vote, do you remember TARP?
Yes, asset relief, something.
Troubled Asset Relief Program. And it's almost quaint to talk about it now, given how much spending and everything else has happened. But that was a huge scandal, and Dad was sort of...
That was the 2008 recession, and we thought the whole world was going to crash.
Thought the whole world was going to crash. That was the big financial meltdown. And the idea behind TARP was injecting enough money into the system to keep the way Dad described it is that banks were stopping lending to each other. And it was like an engine that was going to seize up without any oil.
Mm-hmm.
And so the federal government injected, is it $80 billion into the system, which again now just seems small potatoes. Back then it was huge.
Yeah.
And everybody was like, how dare you? Your spending is awful and this is the worst. These were loans that were paid back with interest. The federal government made money on the Troubled Asset Relief Program, but that was such a huge deal that everybody was furious about it. And he kept having to explain it on the campaign trail. And one of his mantras was, in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And he was losing. And he was losing essentially to demagogues who were happy.
Who were good people to lose, even though they might win the election. But anyway.
Yeah. So he I said to him, if you don't do this, you're going to lose. And he said, then I lose. And he did. And, everybody was like, well, is your father okay? Is he bitter? Is he angry? And I said, you know what? He actually is not. And he's saying things like, I should have retired 6 years earlier because he was doing all these other projects he'd wanted to do. What I would say to them is, look, if you want bitterness and anger, just come talk to me. I've got plenty of that. I'm the one that can provide you with that. And I've pretty much since gotten over that. But in that campaign, I ended up talking to Sam Granado's people. Sam Granado's is a big food service company here in Salt Lake. And Sam Granado was the Democratic candidate in that election. And I ended up talking to him and he said, well, hey, would you come work for me? And I said, I think that might
you were a Republican at one time.
I was very much a Republican. I was a Republican hack. I was as far in as you could possibly be. And I said, I think that might I'd much rather have you as the senator than Mike Lee. But for a number of reasons, one being that I don't recognize the Republican Party as it stands today as being anything like the party that my father represented.
I agree with you totally.
And Mike Lee was a big part of that. Mike Lee wanted to, he wanted to get rid of Social Security altogether. He wanted to amend the Constitution 7 different times in 7 different ways, get rid of the amendment that made slaves citizens. And just all kinds of stuff where I said, I'd much rather have a conservative Democrat like Sam Granado. And so, well, will you work for me? And I said, that's going to embarrass my father. He said, we just won't tell anybody. I just need your help. Well,
okay.
Well, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
I got a call from Paul Raleigh at the Salt Lake Tribune who said, we know you're working for the Granado campaign. Do you want us to run an article with or without a statement from you? And I ended up getting more press in that election cycle than Sam Granado did. I was kind of embarrassed. The Deseret News ran a big front page story that said, Bennett backs blue. And I went, well, I'm not the candidate.
Yeah.
So that pretty much destroyed all of my Republican political stuff. I ended up working as working with a nonprofit. My cousin and I created this nonprofit that we were doing a study that was teaching a cognitive behavioral model to probationers and parolees. And we did that for a number of years. And BYU did a lengthy research study that showed that it cut recidivism by 50%, which was significant. But we can never really find a way to make that work. And in the course of this, I was approached by a guy named Richard Davis, who was a political science professor at BYU. And he was a Democrat. And he says, we want to start a new party. And this was in 2016. Is that right? Or maybe it was 2017, maybe the year after Trump was elected. I think it was the year later, whenever Jason Chaffetz resigned.
Okay.
Because he said, look, you're a prominent former Republican, I'm a prominent former Democrat, and we want to create a centrist party. And we created the United Utah Party. And as soon as we had gathered enough signatures to create the party, Jason Chaffetz announced that he was resigning his seat in Congress to go work for Fox News. and we needed a candidate to run for that seat. And I said, well, what if I'm that candidate? And so I ran for Congress, knowing full well that I was not likely to win. You can't really get up in the morning and run for office and say, well, I know I'm going to lose. So I'd sort of convinced myself that there were miracles that could happen that would put me in office. But I ended up getting 9.4% of the vote, which was a record for a third-party congressional candidate in Utah at the time. That record's since been broken by other United Utah Party candidates who followed me. The party now has been absorbed into the Forward Party. But I ran for office, and then I ended up working with a guy who was really interested in building this sort of consensus tool online that had never really took off. I ran for mayor of Sandy in 2021. And I thought, okay, I can win this because that's a nonpartisan race, which is never really true. Everybody wants to know, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And I was neither. I'd never been a Democrat, but I wasn't Republican enough. Anyway, I ended up losing that race by 21 votes, which was...
I would have voted for you, Jim.
Well, thank you. And I would have lost by 20. That's one of the most excruciating experiences of my life is run for office and lose like that. I mean, I would much rather almost have lost. When I lost the congressional race and only got 9.4% of the vote, that was much easier to take than knowing it was that close and I just couldn't close the deal. So that's kind of my professional background. In the church, I served a mission in Scotland in 87 to 89. My mission president, I had two mission presidents. One was Ben B. Banks, who went on to be in the presidency of the 70. And he's still around. He's still alive, and he's in his 90s. And my second president was Joseph Fielding McConkie, Bruce our son. And he's since passed away, but I
shouldn't ask this, but do you know Mark Robbins by chance? I think he went to Scotland the same time you did.
I don't. An Elder Robbins sounds sort of familiar, but I don't know him.
No problem.
He was in Scotland?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I married the former Laurel Sidwell, and we were gospel doctrine we team taught gospel doctrine in the USC student ward, Southern California. She was getting her master's in physical therapy while I was finishing my undergrad. And we have 5 children, 2 daughters, and then 3 boys after that. And my youngest is now 20, so we're empty nesters. And my oldest is a doctor in Chicago. Very proud of her. She went to the University of Utah Medical School and is now practicing in physical medicine and rehab. And then my next oldest is a girl. She's a doctor she's getting her doctorate, not a medical doctor. If you watch Friends, Ross keeps saying he's a doctor. That's not a real doctor. She's getting a doctorate in public policy, and she's getting it from the University of Southern California, which is really delightful to have her back at my alma mater down there. And I've got twin boys that are both graduating from BYU this year. They also are both running the Boston Marathon in April.
Wow.
And then my youngest is up at the University of Utah and is living with my
so you're a divided household.
We were what?
You're a divided household.
Not really. So all 4 of my oldest went to BYU as undergrads.
Oh.
And my oldest went to the U for medical school, and then my youngest is at the U, but nobody's upset about that. Maybe we should be, but it's wonderful because my mother lives up there, and so my son actually lives with my mother, and she's just is delighted to have him around and
cool.
Helpful. So there, I told you way too much.
Well, very good. Well, we've got some listeners in here. I just wanted to do a few things. Hi from Gurns Island, Glems. I don't know. Guems. I guess I don't know where that is. Might be in Washington, but I was thinking Guernsey Island, England. I've actually been there. But the cool thing is we've got Craig Newsom, Kiora from New Zealand.
Oh, wow.
Craig is a stalwart listener, and so we're worldwide.
Wonderful.
So anyway, and then Pure Spin says, ha ha ha, you've got Bob Bennett's hair.
No, I don't.
That's what Pure Spin says.
Oh, well, because I stole it from him because Bob Bennett didn't have any hair.
That's right.
That's probably where it comes from.
That's right.
This is McKay hair. My mother is the granddaughter of David O. McKay, and her father had a full head of hair, and I'm told that you inherit baldness or hair from your mother's side of the family. So this is David O. McKay genetics.
Ah, there you go. Well, I didn't know that. And then Ultron Versi says, finally a Bennett crossover.
Nice.
So the one thing that there's a few things I want to talk about. I'll give you two topics and you can pick which one you want to go to first. You've got your own podcast with Ian Wilks called Inside Out. Yep. And would love for you to talk a little bit about that. Also, you are one of the producers of the recent YouTube docuseries, An Inconvenient Faith. So I'm going to throw it out to you. Pick whichever one you want, and we'll talk about the other one on the backside.
Okay. Well, I think Robert Reynolds, who was the main. I mean, I didn't have an official title, and Robert Reynolds, who's the brother of Dan Reynolds, who is the lead singer of Imagine Dragons, and he's also the manager of the Killers, when I was on a podcast, he called me and asked, he says, Brandon Flowers really wants to meet you. Brandon Flowers wants to talk to you. And I went, okay. I didn't know the Killers music at all.
Okay.
And do you know the Killers?
I'm trying to think of, there was that guy that had a documentary that died, but it was...
No, the Killers are one of the biggest rock bands in the world, really. And the lead singer is an active member of the church. His name is Brandon Flowers.
Okay.
They sang Mr. Brightside. Do you know that song?
No.
No? Okay. My kids did. But we were sitting at a soccer game, and my cell phone rings, and I answer, and I go, oh, Brandon Flowers. Well, very nice to meet you. And one of the first things I say to him is, the only Killer song I know is the one that's on Guitar Hero. And my daughter just elbows me in the stomach and goes, you can't say that to Brandon Flowers. Doing this laughing goober. But the Robert sort of, in talking to me about this, he said, look, I'm doing a docuseries. Well, it was not a series at that point. It was going to be a documentary, a feature film. And he said, I'm doing it about the church. He had just listened to me. I'm going to back up just a little bit, a little more background here. I mean, the reason why anybody in the church knows who I am is that in 2016, I published a reply to the CES letter. I had written this
we get to talk about that one too. Okay, anyway.
I mean, just very quickly, I had a cousin who had left the church over it, and I had all these people. I was seeing it online, and I'm like, oh, geez, this must be the most powerful critique of the church ever written. And I started to read it, and I had these sort of flashbacks to my own weird little faith crisis when I was 18, and I read The God Makers. And I thought, these are all the same issues. And I had sort of come to terms with them a long time ago. And at the time, back when blogs were an actual thing, I was a regular blogger, and I had written pieces on a lot of these issues. And so I started cutting and pasting pieces of my blog into it. And then I ended up just sort of finishing the rest. And then it was a line by line reply to the CES letter. And I published it, and it crashed my website the first day I uploaded it. I was nobody, but I said, here's my reply to the CES letter. It's since been downloaded over 200,000 times. And it just went massively viral. And I started getting inundated with emails from people saying, thank you, you've helped me save my faith. And at one point, somebody said, okay, I'd love to see you go toe to toe with Bill Reel. And I didn't even know who Bill Reel was. And I said, look, I don't want to debate anybody, but I'm happy to talk to anybody. If Bill Reel wants to talk to me, sure. And within minutes, Bill Reel had found my phone number and given me a call and said, will you come on my podcast? And I said, sure. We ended up doing 14 hours of discussions. And I thought they were really productive discussions, but then I was very frustrated afterward because he sort of run around and said, look how I won my debate with Jim Bennett. And I went, this wasn't a debate. And the fact that you're now framing it as a debate makes it harder for people to have these kinds of conversations. Mm-hmm. But so I ended up having a similar sort of experience with John DeLynn. I went on John DeLynn's podcast. We did about 14 hours. Yeah. I'm amazed at how many people will say, I listened to all
for punishment.
Hours. Yeah. And I'm like, why did you listen to all 14 hours? I don't think I listened to all 14 hours, and I was there. I mean, I was putting out for a good chunk of that. But the messages that I started to get after that were from people who said things like, no, you didn't convince me to come back to church. You didn't convince me to rebuild my faith, but you did help me better understand my family and friends who are still in, and help me to see how you can sort of navigate that with integrity. And I sort of stumbled onto this whole space that I think goes completely unnoticed to a large degree by so many members of the church. And that's people who are sort of, Chris Kimball wrote a book called Living at the Edge of the Inside. And there are so many people that are just on the edge of the church, whether they're on the inside of the edge or they're on the outside of the edge. I mean, these are people who have left, but they're married to somebody who's still an active member of the church. Mixed faith marriages are a huge thing that we never, ever talk about. And, you know, their children are still in, their parents are still in, they still have to navigate this. And I started sort of talking to these folks and saying, we don't ever talk to these people. We don't ever, all we do is scream at each other. If you've left the church, you're obviously Korihor and you're a terrible person. If you stayed in the church, you're obviously a dupe and an idiot. You know, I mean, we just completely polarize and demonize each other. And so I kind of thought, well, what if we didn't do that? What if we took a different approach? What if we were willing to talk to these people in a way that was more productive? And Robert sort of keyed into that, Robert Reynolds, when he heard me on Bill Reel. That's when he called me and said, Brandon Flowers wants to talk to you, because Brandon Flowers listened to that as well. But he said, okay, I'm doing this documentary, and it's... and he says, one of the biggest problems I'm having, though, is I don't have anybody to edit it. He says, because I've given it to sort of Hollywood producers, and they don't really understand the material. And I've given it to Mormons, and they're not very good.
They're not good editors, yeah.
And I said, look, I got some experience with this. I certainly understand the material, and I'd love to help you with that. And so I edited several rough cuts of the initial sort of, I mean, we did a 90-minute version. We've done a 2.5-hour version. We went through all these different iterations over time as to what it was going to look like. And then when he finally decided it was going to be a series, then I ended up, it was like, look, I think I've taken you as far as I can go in terms of my skill here. You need to give this to a real editor that can take the bones of what I put together for you and really make it look good and make it work. And found an editor named Trent Jones who really just, went above and beyond. I mean, he was the right guy to take this across the finish line. But it took years. You know, I this was in 2019 when I started doing this with him. And it was 2025, it was last year when it finally came out. And a lot of the interviews, most of them really, had been done in 2019 or earlier. I mean, these are much older interviews, but it had been put together, and the issues they raise are evergreen. These are not, people want to talk about polygamy. People want to talk about race in the priesthood. People want to talk about all of these challenges. And so we put it across the finish line. And even after I stopped editing it, Robert I was on the email chain and we were commenting and, who else do we need to talk to? What else do we need to do? And I got to go and watch a number of these interviews in person. I got to conduct Paul Reeves' interview because Robert wasn't able to come out for that one. So it was just me and Paul Reeve, and that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I love Paul. Paul's awesome. He's
just wonderful.
Just 3 times, I think, here. Yeah.
And so it's had a very positive impact. It came out while the Tabernacle Choir, and I'm a member of the Tabernacle Choir on Temple Square. I joined in 2019. And it felt a little weird because I joined, and then 8 months later, the whole thing shut down for COVID.
Oh.
And so I went 18 months without being in the choir, and I thought, is this just some kind of beautiful dream that I was in the choir? I don't. But when the choir was in Argentina is when it came out. The choir was on tour in Argentina, and I announced it, and we initially got inundated with, who's put this out? Where did this come from? Who did this?
Yeah, I remember that.
And it was,
a lot of people were wondering.
Because I was the only one whose name was attached to it. And I kind of felt bad because I didn't want to take credit for what Robert had done. He financed the whole thing out of pocket.
Wow.
This was entirely his project. And it's like he was one of the producers on, do you remember Believer? It was the HBO documentary about the Love Loud festival.
Oh, I never saw that, but I kind of remember it, yeah.
Well, he had done that, and so he was looking for different distribution, but it was and we kept trying to figure out ways to make this more appealing to a broader audience. And then Robert finally said, look, I don't really care about making money on this. What I want to do is have this conversation out there. These are things that need to be talked about, and so I'm just going to put it on YouTube. And it's up on YouTube, and I recommend everybody go and watch it. It really is, I think, some of the best sort of representation of the goal of it is very much, I think, the same as the goal of my CES letter reply, which is not to say, here are all the definitive answers to every difficult question, and let's just put it all to bed because this is airtight. Here's the only way to look at it, and this is all proof that the church is true, and you don't have to worry about anything. That approach just, frankly, does not work. And what I did with my CES letter reply was say, look, I know about all of this stuff. I know about Joseph Smith's polygamy and that he was married to Fanny Alger, and that I know about the racist origins of the priesthood ban. I know about all these things. Here is how I manage to incorporate that into a sustainable faith. And he said the goal of Inconvenient Faith was not to say, here are all the answers. It was to say, this is how all of these people stay. All of these people look at all the difficult issues, and this is how we stay. And it was interesting because in that brief window before Robert finally stepped up and said, yeah, that's me, and I did this, you had all these people waiting to see whether or not they could watch it and trust it because they wanted to know what team we were on. It was like the former Mormons were like, okay, well, they've interviewed John DeLynn, and they've interviewed Jeremy Runnels, and they've interviewed all of these people who are critics of the church. So is this an ex-Mormon thing? And then it was like, well, wait a minute, you've also interviewed Patrick Mason and Richard Bushman, and so is this? Did the church put this out, or and ultimately it was interesting because as soon as it became clear that we were leaning essentially more toward the faithful perspective, so many ex-Mormons just kind of wrote it off and said, "Okay, well, forget it. It's all apologetic." And it really isn't. It really isn't. And John Dehlin, I think, is probably the best voice on that, because he was asked, he's like, "They made you into an apologist, John. They made you," because John says some very nice things about the church in it. He also gives his criticisms of the church in it. And the goal was to say, okay, if here's how we stay, here are the issues, here's how we stay. And if you don't stay, if these issues are too much for you to stay, then we love you and we want you to be heard and we don't want to dismiss you. And John had said on Reddit, he's like, "Look, is this what I would have done? No." He says, "Is this the best depiction of former Mormons from a faithful perspective? By a mile, it is. It absolutely is. I mean, we treat John Dehlin and we treat Bill Reel, who's also in it. Sandra Tanner is in it. Just a number of church critics are in it, and we treat them with respect and try and give them, an opportunity to tell their story. And there have been many who've complained that we didn't do that well enough, and I'm sure that's a fair criticism. It's very difficult to, outline all of these issues in even a docuseries like this in any way that would be palatable to a general audience. But I'm very proud of it. If you haven't seen it, the great thing about it is you can dip into it piecemeal. You don't have to sit down for 2.5 hours. You don't have to listen to 14 hours of Jim Bennett and John Dehlin. There are episodes about the Book of Mormon. There's an episode about women and authority, episode about race and the priesthood, episode about two episodes about LGBTQ issues. And I really think it's sort of the best presentation for how people who are troubled by all of these issues are able to sort of integrate them into a faithful perspective. And so that's also, and I guess I'm talking about both of the things that I'm supposed to talk about. That's also kind of where my podcast came from, because I have a friend, Ian Wilks, who nobody in the church, he didn't have the kind of profile that I had for my CES letter reply. He's
an old missionary companion, is that right?
We were not companions, but we served at the same time. I really looked up to Ian. Ian was my zone leader on a couple of occasions. And I was serving in Thurso, Scotland, which is at the end of the world. It's the very northernmost point of the British mainland, and there's nothing up there. It's where the Mackays came from, so I really enjoyed that. The entire Inverness zone of the Scotland-Edinburgh mission was roughly 50% of Scotland's geography, all in the Highlands, and nobody lives up there. I mean, there aren't enough people. So there were 10 missionaries covering the whole top of the country, and all the other missionaries were in the big urban centers like Glasgow and Edinburgh and all those places. But so Ian Wilks, when he was my zone leader, other zone leaders would go on splits with missionaries, but Ian and his companion would come up and stay with us for a week, and we'd spend a week with these guys. So I felt I really got to know him very well on my mission, and we kept in touch after my mission. And he was one of the great friends that I met on my mission, but we were never companions. Ian was a bishop in Scotland. He went back to Scotland. He's from Yorkshire, England. He's an Englishman. He's got a really good. I'm going to do a terrible Ian Wilks accent. I used to do a great one on my mission. We would do it. "I'm Ian Wilks. How you doing, buddy?" He's this very, very strong, striking Yorkshire accent, and he had served as a bishop and moved back to Scotland after his mission, and then moved to Canada and was called into a stake presidency, and he's talked many times about how President Oakes is the guy who interviewed him to be in a stake presidency. He really liked President Oakes. He had a very positive experience with him. But his daughter started finding out kind of the CES letter stuff and started bringing it to Ian and saying, I have real problems with this. And Ian was like, oh, no, well, where did you get this? And she'd say, well, I got it on the internet. Oh, well, that's the problem. You've read this off the internet. That's all anti-Mormon stuff. Stay in it. And the thing that really, I mean, the cliche is, when did your shelf break? But the thing that really broke his shelf was the 2013 Race and the Priesthood essay, Gospel Topics essay. And he read that, and it confirmed everything that his daughter was saying about that issue. And he was saying, look, I told everybody on my mission and elsewhere all of these things that weren't true. And now the church is telling me that all of the critics were right, that this really was just sort of rooted in racism, and that kind of broke him, and he stopped going to church. And
had he been released from the stake presidency at this time?
He had not. He was still in the stake presidency. And the funny thing about that is, so I got a call from Ian, and he said, look, I am in charge of the young single adult retreat up here, and we need a keynote speaker, and I think you would be a wonderful keynote speaker. And so I've recommended you to the stake presidency, and they've agreed, and would you be willing to come up to Canada and speak to our young single adults? And I went, that would be lovely. I would love to do that. And then months and months went by, and I didn't hear anything. And I finally call him, and I say, Ian, we're getting closer to this. Am I still coming up to speak? Do you still want me to come up and speak? Oh, Jim, I'm so sorry. I've left the church.
Oh, my goodness.
It's like, oh, well, that, he says, but they still, here's the phone number of the stake president. And I called the stake president, and he said, yeah, we'd love to have you. So I went up. I took my whole family up there, and I spoke in Ian's stake after Ian had left. And they were all very concerned about him, and they were all, and we spent some time, and I talked through this with Ian, and we discussed his reasons and all of that. And it was several years after that, because I think that was what? Oh, I don't know. That was 2013, 14.
Okay.
He calls me and he says, Jim, I want to do a podcast with you. And now
it was his idea. Okay.
It was his idea. It was 100% his idea. I had people saying, Jim, you ought to do a podcast. You should do a CES letter reply podcast. And I was like, I just couldn't get a handle on that as to what would be a useful and something would be worth the kind of time commitment that a podcast takes. You are well aware, I think, of the kind of commitment that's
I am very well aware.
And so but he said, I want to, he came up with the name too. We were trying to come up with names. He says, you're on the inside, I'm on the outside, let's call it Inside Out, and a perspective. And he says, you don't ever hear faithful members talking to former members. And I said, that's exactly what I've discovered, Ian. I mean, these are the waters I'm sort of swimming in. And I really think there's a need for a podcast that has those kinds of conversations, that has those kinds of dialogues. Now, gets me in trouble. My wife will listen to it and she'll say, Jim, Ian sounds more in than you do. You really think you're representing the inside position? Ian's the one who sounds, because Ian still has great affection for the church. He was in a very difficult working class neighborhood in Yorkshire, very sort of dysfunctional household. He didn't know his father at all. And his mother kicked him out of the house when he joined the church, and at the age of 16. And he just really had a rough sort of life. And the church, he still says, the church saved my life. The church rescued me, saved my life, and introduced me to a world that he is so grateful for all of that. Very frustrated that he can't find a way to sort of believe the doctrine anymore, but there's still great affection there. This is not somebody that is out to tear the church down or to rip it apart. But so we have these conversations, and Ian has been essentially the guy who has, I kind of handle all of the production end of it. I edit all the episodes, and I do all these goofy little AI videos to promote them and whatever else. But Ian's the one who has booked us all these wild guests.
Greg Prince, I saw that one. Yeah.
Oh, Greg Prince. Greg Prince is an honorary third member of the podcast at this point. I had met Greg Prince for Inconvenient Faith. Greg Prince, we interviewed him for Inconvenient Faith. And I really admired Greg Prince. His book, David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism.
Fantastic.
Absolutely fantastic book. And my family were the sources for a great deal of it. I mean, you read it and I'll go, oh, you're quoting Uncle Howard there. This is, oh, yeah. But just a magnificent.
Howard Hunter?
I'm sorry?
Howard Hunter or a different Howard?
Howard Anderson.
Okay.
Is the Uncle Howard he was quoting. Howard Anderson, I lived with Howard and Medine. Medine Anderson was my mother's sister. She's since passed away, but Howard's passed away too. But Howard was the stake president in Los Angeles of the Los Angeles stake. And when I was going to USC, they were my second parents because I lived in their house while I went to USC. But Greg Prince, yeah, I was like, oh, well, I don't know if we could get him. And he's like, I got him. I called him. Like, just called him? Yeah, I called him. And he came on, and Greg seems to have hit it off with both of us. And Greg has written this roadmap for improving Mormonism that's unpublished. Everybody's like, oh, where can I read this roadmap? And Greg's like, I'm not publishing it. So it's like we just read through it. It's only about 20,000 words. It's not a lengthy tome, but it's really, really fun. And we've been going through all of this. And so Greg's been on probably 20 times now.
Oh, wow.
But he's like, do you think we could get Richard Bushman? I'm like, oh, geez, I don't know. Well, I know some people who know him. And then never mind, I got him. I called him. Like, oh, okay. So we had Richard Bushman on twice, and Ian just kind of goes after these guys. And,
that's cool.
And he's kind of become the booking agent to a large degree. But it's been a real labor of love. We really, really enjoyed it.
Is he in Canada or in England now?
He's in Canada still. He's in Canada.
Okay.
Yeah. So we do it remotely. Everything's remote, and that's just fine. And it's just been a lot of fun. And we've been doing it now for 4 years. We're coming up on 4 years. And when we started, we had maybe 700-800 listeners, which we were really happy with. And now we weekly have about 1,700. And so, we're not quite sure what to do with this. And we never tried to monetize it. We talk about it, and people are like, well, how do we donate? How do we do a super chat? Or how? It's like, well, that's not why we did this. We did this because we just feel like this is what we are called to do. This is a conversation that we don't see happening anywhere else to any large degree. And so we want to have it ourselves. So.
Well, very good. I want to get in a few listener comments here. Most of them are about you, but I will just say this. When you were talking about the Killers.
Oh, the New York Dolls, yeah.
I was thinking of New York Doll because his name was Arthur Kane.
Arthur Kane.
And he went by Killer Kane. That's where so when I heard the Killers, I was thinking of Arthur Kane.
So when I came home from my mission, and I went back to the University of Southern California, for the first year, I did not go to the USC ward. I went to the Westwood First Ward. And I was assigned to be the home teacher of a guy named Arthur Kane.
Was it the same guy?
It was the same guy.
No way. Wow. That was a great movie. New York Doll. You guys should watch it.
Well, see, the thing about it is, this is not a story that's going to show up at the end sign. Arthur Kane didn't particularly like me, and I found him a little bit creepy. I just was like, I was this young missionary, and I was assigned to home teach him, and I didn't have a companion, so I'd just show up, and I'd read the little article in the end sign, and he would just be like, why is this dumb kid in my apartment?
That's funny.
And then when I found out he was the bassist for the New York Dolls, I didn't even know who the New York Dolls were, but I had a friend who absolutely did. It's like, you got to introduce me to Arthur Kane. I'm like,
Yeah.
this guy's
This weird guy.
this weird guy. And then when I went to the USC ward, I was replaced as his home teacher by a guy named Greg Whiteley. And Greg Whiteley is the guy who directed that movie.
Oh.
Greg Whiteley was like, you have an amazing story. We need to tell your story. And
yeah, it was a great story.
Movie comes from. And at the end of it, sadly, I mean, they filmed it, and they filmed the whole New York Dolls reunion, which is sort of the culmination of it.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing he would tell me is how much he just hated David Johansen, who was the lead singer of the New York Dolls. He blamed David Johansen for every problem in his life. And, you know, and I remember watching the movie, and it's like, oh, they're reunited and they're not punching each other. So I guess that's good. But so they had this big New York Dolls reunion concert in England. And then Arthur Kane came home, and the next weekend he said, I don't feel well. I really don't feel well. I'm going to go to the emergency room. Found out he had advanced leukemia, and he died.
Yeah.
That weekend.
Sad.
And he just died overnight, and it was just absolutely shocking.
Yeah.
So, I have an Arthur Kane connection, but it's not. I mean,
that's funny.
He didn't particularly like me, and I was a little intimidated. I was just kind of scared of him. He just was. So anyway.
Well, that's funny. Some other comments. This is from Perirao. I don't know how you say that. Inside Out is the only podcast my wife and I can listen to together since I left the church. If every Mormon was more like Jim, I'd have very little problem with the church. Wish I could stay and listen to this all live, but I'll catch the rest when it's published on YouTube later. So
that is very kind, and I am very heartened by messages like that, because that's the reason we keep doing this. What I didn't realize when he said, "I wish I could stay," I thought he was talking about, "I wish I could stay in the church."
Oh yeah.
Because
I wish you could stay in the church too.
Well, I do too. See, one of the things one of the things that I've discovered in this space is that, you know, when we demonize people who leave, and we call them, I mean, I don't want to besmirch President Nelson, but, you know, when you call them lazy learners and you call them lax disciples, or if you say they left because they want to sin, you know, I've said many times, look, theoretically, I think that's possible that someone would leave if they wanted to sin. I have yet to meet that person, because every single person I've met who leaves the church does so after trying desperately to find any possible way to stay. I mean, far from being a lax disciple or a lazy learner, I mean, they're going down rabbit holes, and they're digging through all this stuff and going, how can I stay knowing all this stuff? And I just think the characterization we have of people who leave is almost universally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that we don't seem to realize is that when they leave, all of the goodness they had while they were in the church doesn't just evaporate into the wind. I mean, they're still the same person, and they're still good, kind people. And many of them, you know, still have affection for the church and wish they could have stayed. But they just go, my shelf broke. This is just too much. I don't know how to do that. So anyway, appreciate the comment, though.
Well, very good. A few more comments. Jeannie Diamond says hello. Ultron verse. I didn't watch the 14-hour Mormon Stories interview. I did, however, watch all 8 hours of the Patrick Mason interview. Max Jenkins. I love Jim and his In and Out. He said In and Out too. It's Inside Out podcast with Ian.
Maybe if In-N-Out Burger would sponsor the podcast, we'll change the name.
It would change it. All right. Ultron verse said, I thought Jim was related to Heber J. Grant. Is he related to David O. McKay? You can answer both of those.
I am related to both. I am indeed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. this is sort of a Heber J. Grant knows. I have sort of Heber J. Grant's body and David O. McKay's hair. My grandmother on the Bennett side, Frances Grant Bennett, was the last surviving child. The only children that Heber J. Grant had were daughters that lived to adulthood. He had one son, I think, that died younger. But she was the last surviving daughter of Heber J. Grant. So on my father's side, I have the Grants, and on my mother's side, I have the McKays. My mother is a McKay. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is my big kick, the thing that, and Robert Reynolds will talk about this too. Robert Reynolds, when he was doing Inconvenient Faith, we were trying to come up with all of these different episodes about different topics. And the one that was closest and nearest to his heart was the topic of prophetic fallibility. He says, the way you stay is that you recognize that fallibility is part of the plan, that it is the plan. It's not just enough to say, oh yeah, prophets can make mistakes and we'll just sort of acknowledge fallibility. Fallibility is the central purpose of mortality. It's the reason we came here. We came here to learn from our mistakes, to learn the good from the evil ourselves. Each of us was Adam and Eve, and we each made the choice to leave the presence of God and enter into a world to learn for ourselves. And so and that perspective, I think, is the only way to sort of maintain a healthy faith. And when I was growing up, the legacy of Heber J. Grant and David O. McKay, I didn't actually know I was Heber J. Grant's great-grandson until I was a little older, because he'd been dead for a lot longer than David O. McKay had. But I was born, David O. McKay was the president of the church when I was born. He died within a year of I don't, obviously, if I met him, I don't think either one of us would have remembered that. He was fairly deep into dementia by that point. But but I always felt this kind of, well, he's David O. McKay, and I'm this stupid schlub. I'm just Jim Bennett. And it was this extraordinarily kind of discouraging thing to know that I couldn't come anywhere close to measuring up to that kind of a legacy. And the way he was deified in family stories and in family conversations. The family name for him is, my mother, whenever she talks about him, she refers to him as Papa Dade. When Papa Dade was doing this, and Papa Dade did that, and Papa Dade performed their wedding, and Papa, and it's like I didn't feel any connection to this man who I had never met. And then I served my mission in Scotland, which is where the McKays came from, and he served his mission in Scotland. And when I was up in Thurso, Scotland, which is where I got to know Ian Wilks really well, there was nothing up there. And I was sent up there by Ben Banks and said, look, we're going to put you up there for 6 months, and if we can't get a baptism, we're going to just shut the whole place down. We ended up getting a baptism in the city of Wick. We baptized a wonderful family, but that's a different story. And they sent me up there and they said, well, what are we going to do to get anybody to pay attention to us? And we struck on the idea of we should do a fireside or a public lecture. It wouldn't be it was going to be something that would have a sort of secular ring to it. And we were going to call it A Prophet from Thurso. And I was going to just sort of give this talk about David O. McKay as a public service in a lecture or whatever. It never materialized, and I'm really not quite sure why it didn't. But at the time, my grandfather, and this is kind of clumsy because my grandfather is also David McKay, David Lawrence McKay, went by the name Lawrence, but he was writing a book called My Father David O. McKay. So it's not My Father David O. McKay, it's his book, My Father David O. McKay. And they were writing this book, and back then, we obviously didn't have Zoom, and I wasn't even allowed to call home at Christmas.
Right.
Very strict rules. And so Ben Banks said, okay, I'm going to call your parents and see if we can get some material for you so that you can do this lecture about David O. McKay. And so they call and they said, oh, yeah, we've got all this source material that your grandfather's using for his book. We'll send that to you. And one of the things they sent me was a copy of David O. McKay's missionary journal. And this was a major turning point in my life because David O. McKay was a lousy missionary. Genuinely, well, that's harsh. By today's standards, he would have probably been sent home because he would take days off all the time. He would go tour whiskey factories in Glasgow. He writes up a big journal entry about, yeah, we toured the whiskey factory. It's like, well, aren't you supposed to be out? And other days he'd be like, it's raining today. We're not going to go out. Like, it's raining today in Scotland? It
rains all the time.
Every day in Scotland. But he was discouraged. He was pining for his girlfriend. I was pining for my girlfriend, who dumped me right after I got home. That's another story altogether. Greatest thing that ever happened to me. But his girlfriend was my great-grandmother, ended up being my great-grandmother. But he was pining for her, and he was borderline racist. He'd talk about how dirty the Scots were and how ugly and haggard they were. And I'm sitting here reading this book, and he was essentially pulled into mission leadership relatively early into his mission, and so most of his mission was administrative. It wasn't. He didn't spend a lot of time proselyting. He was all working in the office, and I. If you listen to David O. McKay talk about it, he tells this story of being discouraged and frustrated, but then he sees, do you not remember this story? He sees the plaque, the one that's now in the missionary training center in Provo that said, "Whate'er thou art, act well thy part."
Oh, yeah.
And he says, that was it. That was the big turnaround for me. And I realized I needed to just commit myself. Well, first of all, that story doesn't even show up in his journal. If it was that big a deal to him, it became that big a deal to him in retrospect. It wasn't impactful enough that it was significant at the time. And second of all, the discouragement never really fully went away. He would still complain. He would still... And the reason why I say it was wonderful is that once I look at that and go, oh, geez, if he went from that to being David O. McKay, then there's hope for a schlub like Jim Bennett. And I don't think we realize how much we discourage people when we act like our prophets are demigods, that they came down from Mount Olympus fully formed, and it's such a better story, and I think the story that the Lord has wanted us to tell all along, to say, look at all of the amazing things this church has been able to accomplish, despite the weaknesses and setbacks and failures and mistakes of its leaders and of its members. That is such a more powerful story to me than, there's this handful of perfect men who have led this church. That doesn't work. So the whole idea of prophetic fallibility, to me, is the key to how do you stay in knowing the difficulties. And I had this conversation with John DeLynn offline because years ago I was invited down to a lunch with the folks at what's now Scripture Central. Back then it was Book of Mormon Central. This is Jasmine Rapley and her husband Neil Rapley, and Stephen Smoot was there, a number of other folks, and they said, okay, we have just come from a meeting with the secretary of the Quorum of the 12, and they've given us statistics as to how many people the CES letter has driven out of the church, and and it's in the tens of thousands. And they have also done a great deal of research to determine what it is that mitigates that. Is there any way that we can mitigate that? He says, and there is only one thing that is effective, and that is Jim Bennett's CES letter reply. And I was like, wow. They said, yeah, so we would like to advertise your reply. And I went, oh. He says, we've gotten some money, and we would like to spend quite a bit of it to advertise your reply. And I went, oh, great. Do I see any of that money? No, of course not. Well, okay, that's great. and they stopped doing that because I think there was a little bit of a Streisand effect going on, because a lot of people that didn't have any clue about what the CES letter knew about, it was getting Scripture Central saying, read this reply, and the reply has the full CES letter in it because it's a line-by-line response.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that they were a little nervous that was introducing them all to it. But so later, when I'm having this conversation with John DeLynn, and we're eating lunch in between video sessions, I said, I genuinely don't understand what it is about my reply that would make it effective when other sorts of approaches have not been. And John says, oh, I know why. Because you don't know why? I know exactly why. Like, oh, really? Why? And he says, because you're able to say sometimes the church has been wrong. He says that's it. And that's the right answer in a number of the places. And the church won't ever say that publicly. But they're very happy to let you say it. And I mean, that really, I mean, if the church was wrong is never an acceptable answer, then you can't stay in the church. As far as I couldn't stay in the church. If I had to figure out some way to say, well, Brigham Young, when he said that the law of God, which will always be so, is that if the men of the chosen seed mix their seed with the seed of Cain, the punishment is death on the spot. If I couldn't look at that and say, well, Brigham Young was full of beans, he was just wrong. If you can't say that, and you've got to find some way to justify that, I couldn't do it. And the people who do it end up looking ridiculous because you can't do it. You have to accept the reality that, a prophet. I mean, one of the things that drives me crazy, people say, well, they always say, oh, well, he was only speaking as a man. He wasn't speaking as a prophet. I'm like, at what point does a prophet cease to be a man when he's speaking? A prophet is always speaking as a man, even when he is speaking as a prophet. Always. There is never a moment when a prophet has their agency extracted from them. And so they are incapable of making an error. Agency, the ability to choose, the ability to make a mistake, is the purpose of the plan that we all accepted. The one where we weren't allowed to make mistakes was the one we rejected. So we should expect that there are going to be mistakes. And some of them are going to be big ones. And one of the reasons that they endure, one of the reasons I think the priesthood ban endured long past its shelf life, because when it first was introduced, it really was not all that different from the mores of the world in which they were living. And I think it didn't even go challenged for 50 years or so because the world was just as racist as we were. And then when the world starts to figure it out, we still cling to the mistake because we don't want to admit it was a mistake. We don't want to say, well, Brigham Young got it wrong. It's much easier. And this is bizarre to me, but it's much easier to say, well, God's just a racist for reasons we don't understand.
Yeah, I hate that explanation.
Than to say that Brigham Young was a racist. We want to protect Brigham Young's reputation, but throw God under the bus.
And it's not just that, Jim, because I gave a Christmas lesson, which I actually posted here on my Gospel Tangents channel about Christmas. It was a December lesson I wanted to post about Christmas. I wanted to make sure that, dang it, we're going to learn something new. And so I was talking about the star and Herod's death in 4 BC. So Christ had to be born before 4 BC. I think a lot of people are like, what? 4 BC? Where's that? Anyway, so they were kind of going along with me. I was like, maybe 6 BC and Jupiter and Saturn, and that might have been the star. And then I said, and then, by the way, in Luke, it says there's a census when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, Well, Cyrenius was governor in 4 AD, so that's like 10 years later. And there's no record of a census happening in 4 AD. And so Luke and Matthew disagree.
It would have destroyed the economy for everybody to have to go back to their ancestral homeland. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Right. But I think in priesthood lessons, people are like, what? The Gospels are, Luke's wrong? What? And I'm quoting Thomas Wayment from BYU about, yeah, he's wrong, and whatever. And they were like, now what? The Bible's wrong. And I'm like, we believe the Bible as far as it's translated correctly, right? But Matthew and Mark and Luke should agree. So it's just funny. It's not just Brigham Young, but even the Bible, I'm so grateful that we can use a non-King James version of the Bible now.
Yeah.
Because even though we know the Bible is good as far as it's translated correctly, everybody treats it as if it's translated correctly. Unless Joseph Smith says something different. But they don't treat other things like Luke and Matthew as being, they're off 10 years.
Well, are you a Dan McClellan fan?
I am a huge Dan McClellan fan.
I am a huge Dan McClellan fan too, and Ian's gotten him on our podcast. It's like, Dan McClellan. We're going to have him on in a few months. But he goes through this all the time, and everybody just screams at him, "Well, how can you still be a member of the church?" And it's like, guys, this is our theology. This is what we teach. We don't believe in infallible scripture. Right. Even the Book of Mormon on the title page says if there are mistakes, they are the mistakes of men.
Yeah.
We don't believe, infallibility and inerrancy are not part of the mortal experience. And we teach that, but then we don't, we want to pick up one end of the stick without picking up the other end. It's like, well, if they're capable of making mistakes, then maybe there are some mistakes. Well, no, there aren't any mistakes. I mean, I had a conversation with my nephew once. We're like, don't you think that the Lord could call somebody who could be a racist? And he said, well, he could, but he never has. And I was like, come on. That's not how this works.
Yeah. I want to pull up another comment here from Poke Phantom. Definitely agree with how Mormons view people who leave need to be treated with more care than it has been historically. I am going to just mention to everybody, so I've had Janice Allred. She's Margaret Toscano's sister. She's been excommunicated for 30 years. The thing that's amazing to me about Janice is she still goes to church every single week. She has such a testimony of the gospel. And so we're going to talk, at Sunstone, they have this thing called Why I Stay, and I do not understand why Janice stays for 30 years. Like, if anybody had a reason to leave, it would be Janice Allred. She's going to be coming on in a couple of weeks, hopefully. I haven't got the date down yet, but probably in a couple of weeks. And she's going to talk about why she stays. And so I just think it's amazing. But we do need, I totally agree with you. I think it's great that you're talking to Ian, and, I have a lot of non-member friends. In fact, I have a friend, a former Mormon, and I invited him to priesthood. He lives in another town, and I was like, you should come to my priesthood lesson. He's like, I think I will. I was like, sweet. So I don't think he's going to get rebaptized anytime soon. But, we do need to treat people better. What do you want to say to that?
Well, you mentioned Janice Allred still going to church. The editor of the book, My Father, David O. McKay, is a woman by the name of Lavina Fielding Anderson.
Yeah, she's awesome. I wish I could have gotten her on.
I mean, she's passed away now, but she went to church for the remainder of her life after her excommunication.
Yeah, she's another one.
She's just as faithful as anybody. Tried very hard to get rebaptized, was never allowed to do that. I think I've heard rumors that posthumously they've restored her blessings, but I don't know if that's true.
Well, what I heard was somebody submitted her name and got her rebaptized after her death without going through the family, and so the family's a little upset about that. But because it should be their thing, not So anyway, let's see here. Here's another one from Ultron Verse here. I always enjoy when I hear stories when prophets and apostles admit their flawed mortality been that way since Joseph Smith to now with the recent devotional President Oak case. That was another thing I mentioned to you. I wanted to talk a little bit about. President Oaks just gave his first address at BYU. In fact, the funny thing is last week I had Josh Gailey from the Church of Jesus Christ, also known as the Bickertonites, and he told me that he was sticking around last weekend and he was going to teach a couple classes at BYU after President Oaks' address. That was how I found out about it. I didn't even know President Oaks was speaking. And I know that there was some hay made about, hey, he mentioned podcasts or something.
Yeah.
And do you want to talk a little bit about that? Do you have any comments on what President Oaks said?
Yeah. And in fact, so we were doing a live stream that night and didn't really even think about that. And we ended up sort of being one of the first sort of outlets to publicly discuss this right after it happened. I didn't watch it at the time. I went and watched it before the podcast so I could talk about it in an informed
I still haven't watched it.
Yeah. It's not very long. There was another speaker beforehand who I didn't watch, and his was probably about 15, 20 minutes at most.
Okay.
It really wasn't that long. My reaction then is still my reaction now. And what I said then is that I found it very encouraging and very frustrating at the same time. Because one of the things that was extraordinarily encouraging about it is that President Oaks, I think in many ways for the first time, acknowledged some of the significant challenges the church is facing right now in ways that surprised a lot of people. I talked about Jasmine Rapley. She did a video. She's like, he talked about people who leave. Like, haven't we just been told that we've had more convert baptisms and that the church is growing faster than it's ever been growing? His focus was on people who leave. And that just seemed to be sort of a surprise to her and to others, because he admitted, he said, look, the even faithful, active members are having problems with historical, doctrinal, and social issues in the church. And, that's not something you hear from the president of the church very often. You hear the lazy learners and lax disciples thing. He also admitted that there's a big challenge that lots of return missionaries are leaving the church. And we've, got anecdotal evidence that that's been happening, but we've never had president of the church just flat out say it. So I came away from that devotional saying, okay, President Oaks understands exactly what the problems are and is not trying to sugarcoat them. He gets it. He knows the problems the church is facing. So that was what was so encouraging. What was frustrating was the answer wasn't really an answer at all. The answer was, be patient. In the meantime, don't be talking to people outside the church. Just surround yourself with believers. And just it'll all work out. Be patient. And I just thought, if that were to work, then why are we still having these challenges? One of the other things that is a drum I keep beating is that I get some people who criticize me saying, omnibar is the satanic word for mark of the beast. What does that mean?
I don't know. I'm not too worried about some of those weird comments.
Okay.
Sorry. I didn't know that popped in there.
So that popped in there. I was like, is that a cool?
I was scrolling through the comments. I was like, well, how did you see that one, Jim?
Anyway, that came up. I thought, do I need to comment on that?
I don't know what that was about.
But one of the drums I keep beating is this idea that we keep pretending that we have a choice as to whether or not we're going to confront all of the messiness of our history and of our doctrine head on. That we have a choice as to whether or not we can talk about it. We have a choice as to whether or not people are, because we don't. Information has been democratized to the point where, the only way you could learn when I was a missionary, the only way you could learn about Brigham Young talking about death on the spot for interracial couples, or Adam God, or any of the other sort of problems there, is if some weird minister guy drops the pamphlet with lots of misspellings in a brown paper bag on your doorstep when if he finds out that you're meeting the missionaries. I mean, this was not information that was widely available. It's not. I don't have a lot of sympathy for people like, well, the church was suppressing it. They didn't need to suppress it, because the only way you could find it is through rigorous sort of academic engagement. This was not stuff that was just out there in the zeitgeist. And now it is. Now it's a Google click away. And the church is still acting like we can pretend that we don't see any of that. Or we're not going to engage with any of that. And so that is the element of the devotional that I found very frustrating, was that he's identified the problem in a way that is much better than I think any previous church president has ever done. But the solution is still elusive. We still haven't, and I think the solution is inevitable. Eventually, we're going to get there, because we have no choice but to get there. Whether we're going to be dragged there, or whether we're going to willingly go there and just sort of confront this head on, is still, I think, somewhat an open discussion, because right now we're opting for the dragging option. So that was my reaction to it. The other thing about it, and I think this is significant, is that you really, really get the sense from President Oaks just how seriously he is taking this calling, and how much it has humbled him. His whole demeanor has changed. You would listen to President Oaks in conference, and people would decry how arrogant he may have sounded. I don't know that he sounded arrogant per se, but I did think he sounded sort of lawyerly, detached. It was just this kind of, well, here's my scholarly analysis of where this issue is. And you didn't really get a sense of his humanity in a way that I think you really do get now that he is president of the church. There is a humility there and a humanity there that is really remarkable to see. And I first saw that when I was singing in the Tabernacle Choir at President Nelson's. He had a funeral that I wasn't able to sing at. I had to work, but they had a memorial service that they threw together like a couple days later, and I was able to sing at that. And one of the things that frankly frustrated me about President Nelson was that every time he would walk into the conference center, the whole place stands up, as we do, which frustrates me, because it's like, to me, that's an act of worship. That's not, and we're silent. We wait for him to walk to his chair. And I remember growing up watching President Hinckley do that. And President Hinckley was always like kind of embarrassed by it. And was like, okay. And finally he'd sit down. He's like, okay, sit down, everybody. President Nelson would walk in, and he'd walk over to somebody and he'd talk to them for a minute and we'd all be standing there, and it'd be 5 minutes. And I'd just be like, could you please sit down, President Nelson? Please? We all want to sit down. Could you just let us do that? And so here I am.
You didn't want to lead everybody in sitting down?
No, well, President Nelson, bless his heart, again, I am not trying to speak evil of him. President Nelson very much enjoyed, I think, the adulation in a way that, Peggy Fletcher Stack talks about her conversations with Gordon B. Hinckley. And Gordon B. Hinckley would say, adulation is a drug that I fight every day.
Yeah, she said that on my podcast.
Yeah. But Russell Nelson was addicted to it. This is a drug that he quite liked. He was just, well, this is wonderful. I love this. And that frankly bugged me. So it's terrible. I'm an awful human being. But anyway, so
another
here
comment.
we are in...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Well, at this memorial, I'm almost done. Sorry, I know I rant. I'm ranting. At this memorial, everybody stands up for President Oaks when he walks in, and he was literally sort of shocked by that. He was like, "Oh, no. You know, I mean, he did this thing. Sit down. Even before we got to his chair. And part of that, somebody next to me was like, well, he's not president of the church yet. That's what it means. I'm like, well, okay, yeah, but he very clearly, that isn't something that he's craving or something that he is really interested in. There was a genuine humility to that I found very refreshing and very encouraging. And I see that in how he addresses the church. I saw that in that devotion. So
somebody else mentioned something about President Oaks. Let's see here. Here it is. Danny Tunnel King. My problem with Oaks was when he said, we don't apologize, nor do we seek apologies. He said that to Peggy Fletcher Stack, by the way.
Yeah.
While smiling, I found it offensive and arrogant.
Yeah.
Comments?
I don't like that either. Because I think the way forward is fallibility. The way forward, I mean, I've talked about this with a lot of folks in a lot of different settings. And I've talked about this with just sort of lay members, but I've talked about this with church leaders, some prominent church leaders. And, you know, one of the things that you find when you talk to a prominent church leader, my father always tells the story. He used to tell the story. He was in the same ward as Harold B. Lee when Harold B. Lee was the president of the Quorum of the 12. And at the time, my uncle, David Bennett, was writing priesthood manuals for the church. Now, David Bennett, he's since passed away, was probably the most brilliant man I've ever met. He got a PhD in philosophy and mathematics at the same time. And he wrote one thesis for both of them, and it was a philosophical treatise written entirely in mathematical symbols. And the only revisions he was asked to make to it were the philosophy department asking him to explain what the math symbols meant, and the math department having to explain what the philosophy was. You know, but I mean, he was just an unbelievably brilliant man, and a kind man, just a lovely, lovely human being. And he was tasked with writing priesthood manuals for the church. And this is actually the beginning days of correlation, because again, before correlation, you know, the Sunday school and the priesthood department and the Relief Society, these were all sort of separate churches, and they would have like fundraisers on, and they would have them on the same night. Was I going to go to the young women's fundraiser, or am I going to go to the priesthood, the elders quorum fundraiser? You know, and so correlation was an attempt to rein all this in. And Harold B. Lee, as president of the Quorum of the 12, was the guy in charge of that. And in many ways, we're still sort of living in Harold B. Lee's church, because that correlation, that's what led to the 3-hour block. That's what led to a whole bunch of different things that are still very much a part. It's a 2-hour block now. But, David's supervisor in the 12 was Richard L. Evans, the voice of music and the spoken word.
Right.
The last, I think, apostle to publicly wear a mustache while he was an apostle.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And Richard L. Evans would read David's stuff and say, David, this is brilliant. This is absolutely brilliant. I just love this. This is great. And then he'd take it to correlation, and he'd take it to Harold B. Lee, and Harold B. Lee would say, hate it, change it, rip. Harold B. Lee was the least diplomatic person. I mean, just very, very sort of type A personality. Just nope. And he'd come back with all of these things, and David would be like, well, wait a minute. Aren't you guys apostles? Don't you guys, I mean, how is it that you think that what I'm doing is great and he thinks it's terrible? And then Joseph Fielding Smith became president of the church, and David's like, Joseph Fielding Smith doesn't get any of this. I mean, he's how can he be president of the church? He's barely able to stand up. And, so they're going through all of this, and my father found himself he says he was in the lobby of the Hotel Utah with Harold B. Lee. And I'm not sure what the occasion was, but they knew each other. And this is long before my father was anybody. I mean, he wasn't a senator. He wasn't any big deal. He was just a guy in Harold B. Lee's ward. And Harold B. Lee says to him, hey, whatever happened to your brother David? And Dad tells him the story. And he says that Harold B. Lee got visibly angry. And he says, oh, for heaven's sakes, doesn't he realize we're just men? He's like, I mean, people in other countries, they never get here. They never get to see us up close, and maybe they can put us on a pedestal, but your brother should know better than that. We're just men, but we're doing the best we can. Dad thought that was the take home to it. And I go, okay, well, that's great, Dad. That's a great story. Why doesn't Harold B. Lee stand up and tell that story in public? Because that's not a story you ever hear.
Right.
But you do hear variations of that story when you talk to leaders one-on-one, because they're not going to tell you that they're infallible. They know just exactly how fallible they are. They know they're capable of screwing up. They know they're capable of making mistakes. And so one of these conversations with somebody, the reaction was, oh, geez, I mean, it would be devastating to so many members of the church, because so many members of the church have this faith in who we are, and that would tear it down. And my response to them was, well, but their faith is in something that isn't true. That's not a sustainable faith. If their faith is in your infallibility, then they're a faith crisis waiting to happen, because that's where faith crises come from. And it's not even just that they get something wrong. It's that they lose trust in the institution. When I mean, with my CES letter reply, for instance, one of the things Jeremy Runnels in the CES letter is just obsessed with, he mentions it 14 times, is the rock and the hat. And, Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon with a rock and the hat. And it wasn't just that the rock and the hat was a bad thing. It was, nobody ever told me about this stupid rock and the hat. How am I supposed to trust you if you're not willing to tell me the truth? And so it becomes a trust crisis more even than a faith crisis.
Right.
I can't trust this institution. And from my perspective, I think, okay, if Dallin Oaks were to stand up in conference and admit that the priesthood ban was absolutely a mistake, and we made a mistake, we shouldn't have done this, here's the reasons why we made the mistake, and we're very sorry and we apologize for it. There would be, in the short term, I think, a lot of people who would get very rattled by that, and probably a lot of them would leave the church. Long term, it would be the healthiest way for the church to build trust that I could possibly imagine. Because a church that trusts you enough to tell you the truth, even when it's a truth that makes them look bad, is a church you can trust in return. And a church that doesn't trust you to admit any kind of mistakes becomes very, very hard to trust. And that's where people fall out of the boat. So what we keep doing is just sort of kicking the can down the road. That eventually we just don't have a choice. Eventually we're going to be confronted with all of this in a way that we're not going to be able to. We've seen it happen. We've seen it happen with the Gospel Topics essays. We've seen it happen when the church finally admitted publicly that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, which is bizarre to me because I had known Joseph Smith was a polygamist most of my life, but I was raised in a family where we talked about stuff like that. Most people weren't. I just always like, have you read Section 132? That's been in print for a long time. It's pretty clear Joseph Smith was a polygamist. But regardless, I mean, this is the thing, is that President Oaks very much thinks that admitting that, I mean, even though I think personally he recognizes that better than anybody, he thinks that admitting that publicly would destroy faith. And it probably would, but it would be destroying faith in something that isn't true. You know, eventually your faith, if your faith is going to be sustainable, it has to be rooted in the truth. I mean, Boyd K. Packer, I think, was probably the worst offender in this. I mean, some things that are true are not very useful. And, you know, so it's, we just don't have any other excuse. We don't have any other way to deal with it.
So you mentioned that polygamy. I got a comment here from For Zion. Would be interested in Jim's take on the polygamy denier movement and the church action against them. It seems they are factually wrong, but action is taken against them. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, you know, we had Michelle Brady Stone on our podcast, who I think was sort of leading the charge on this. Mm-hmm. She was asked to take all of her stuff down, and she did, in order to prevent excommunication. And then we had, her name is escaping me. I'm embarrassed because we just had her on our podcast not long ago.
Karen Hyatt?
Yes, Karen Hyatt, thank you. Was just on, and she's like, oh, I'm not taking it down. I'm not backing down from it. And she was excommunicated. And as far as I know, she continues to go to church and continues to participate. From my perspective...
Before you go there, I have to tell you, I interviewed a polygamous couple, polygamous family, and the three of them, a husband and two wives, got excommunicated in consecutive weeks, 1 week, 3 weeks basically. And they continued to go to church, and the bishop actually told them, can you please not come anymore? And I was like, visitors welcome. Yeah. Guess not.
Yeah.
So there's that issue too. But anyway.
My feeling on it is, I think they're factually wrong. You know, Michelle Brady Stone got mad at me because it's like, no, you haven't convinced me that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. But what she had convinced me of, and I am still convinced of, is that there is room in this church for people who believe stupid things or wrong things. I don't want to be cruel to call her stupid. Michelle Brady Stone and Karen Hyatt are both very, very bright people. But you can believe wrong things. No, I'm not going to get excommunicated if I believe, if I believe Cain is Bigfoot. I mean, that's goofy and weird, but I'm allowed to believe that. As long as I'm not, trying to convince other people that is the position of the church, although Spencer Kimball did a pretty good job of doing that. That's another story altogether.
About Bigfoot?
Well, he in the Miracle of Forgiveness, he tells that story of Cain in the woods, and
and David Patton.
Yeah, it's the only reason that thing endures. Everybody else, we would have forgotten it long ago if he hadn't dug it up for that. But the thing is, I'm allowed to believe all kinds of nonsense, and the reality is, and I probably do. And the other thing, I mean, one of the big criticisms I get is people say, "Well, Jim Bennett he's not really living. This isn't real Mormonism. It's Jim Bennett Mormonism." I'm like, yeah. Damn right, it's Jim Bennett Mormonism. You know what else? Everybody's Mormonism is unique to them. Everybody lives their faith in a way that is unique to them. I mean, and so it's like the idea. Okay, well, this is a belief that you're just not allowed to have. Is just strikes me. If Michelle Brady Stone were advocating, for instance, hey. Adultery doesn't deserve the bad rap that it gets. I think everybody should commit adultery, and I'm going to help you to do that. And that's somebody that can't be within the boundaries of the church. That's somebody that is out of bounds. Somebody that believes something that is wrong. To me, if that's out of bounds, then all of us are out of bounds. Because everybody has a belief or something that isn't orthodox or that isn't, I don't see anything positive accomplished by kicking someone like that out of the church. Do you agree with that?
I'm totally with you. I keep telling this story, but I think it's a great story. I had a friend who was Jewish when I was a manager at Walmart, and so we would talk at lunch or whatever. And one of the things that he said was, it is impossible to get excommunicated from Judaism. And I go, really? What about for murder? And he goes, even for murder, God is your judge, not man. And I was like, wow. Because if there's any reason to get excommunicated, I think murder qualifies. but short of that, or rape and some, terrible things. But breaking the law, those kinds of things, I don't like apostasy. I don't like any of those reasons. I don't think any polygamy denier should get excommunicated. I don't like it. The one thing that I will say that I don't think, and I should probably say polygamy skeptics, or I think polygamy revisionists is the new politically correct term. But the one thing that I haven't heard polygamy revisionists talk about, because lately last week there was a stylometry thing out there. I need to wade through it because I'm a math guy, and I listened to one of them, and I was like, I need to look at the graphs. I need to understand what's going on here. I don't understand, because these are kind of some weird statistical techniques. But at any rate, I'll reserve judgment on them until I really can dive into them. But the idea among the revisionist movement is that what DNC 132 is a Brigham Young forgery, essentially. That Joseph Smith didn't really write it. Joseph Smith's innocent. It's all Brigham Young. They really throw Brigham Young under the bus. And I remember I talked to William V. Smith, Bill Smith. He's a professor at BYU, blogs by common consent, some other things like that. And he had written a book years ago about Section 132. He's just got a new one out on the King Follett sermon. And I asked him point blank, so, because there's that part about Emma Smith and she'll be destroyed in Section 132. And I'm like, can we just cut those, 6 verses out? And Bill's response was, I think we should just leave it alone. He goes, the problem is the critics are going to say, look, they're hiding what was in there before. He's like, we just have to deal with it. They're not the best verses. But he said, and Denver Snuffer, before he got excommunicated, he has a book, Passing the Heavenly Gift. And one of the things he said, I don't know if this is historically accurate. I think it's not historically accurate, but I like it. And I wish it were true, even if it's not true. And, you talk about Jim Bennett Mormonism. This is Rick Bennett Mormonism here. But Denver said that the DNC 132 can be divided into 4 different revelations. And he separates the sealing power from polygamy, which I love that idea. And I would love to separate the sealing power from polygamy. But Bill Smith said, you can't separate them. You can't just cut up 132 into the parts you like and the parts you don't like.
I'm still listening, but I'm being told I need to vacate this room. So
we probably should head out here soon. But anyway, but at any rate, I love the idea of separating the sealing power from polygamy. But Bill said they're so intertwined, it's going to cause more damage than anything. And I think that's, at least I haven't heard anyone, especially those that say that 132 is a forgery, which is almost all of them. I don't think any of them, any polygamy revisionists don't think it's not a forgery. But they don't ever answer that question about how do you how can you keep the sealing power and say that 132 is a forgery? I've never heard any coherent answer to that. I don't know if you have, but I've not heard one yet. And so I think that's why, because it becomes a theological issue. That's why the church feels comfortable silencing some of these, shall we say, noisy critics on the polygamy revisionist front. And I don't like it. the church can do what it wants. You don't have any power. If they want you gone, you're gone. Like there's not a lot you can do about it. But that I think that's why the church takes such a hard line on that issue. Comments on that?
Well, no, I mean, I've said many times that one of the reasons why I can't square that circle is that it doesn't make it easier to say, oh, well, Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist, and so he wasn't all of these difficult, he wasn't marrying 14-year-old girls, and he wasn't lying to Emma, and he wasn't. Isn't that great? Because everybody wants a pure, perfect Joseph Smith. It's like, well, okay, but what's the price you pay to create the pure, perfect Joseph Smith? You create an unbelievably monstrous Brigham Young, because then Brigham Young is creating polygamy as an absolute lie, using Joseph as the fall guy, and so he's fabricating, and Brigham Young becomes an absolute monster.
And I've heard that many times. Many times. Sure. Not only from polygamy skeptics, but people who are upset about Mountain Meadows and some other things. But anyway, yeah.
Well, there are plenty of people who think Brigham Young was a monster. But if you're going to believe that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has priesthood keys that were restored to Joseph Smith and are now being held by Dallin H. Oaks, Brigham Young is a pretty important link in that chain. How do you get from there to here? I don't understand how people square that circle. Now, Karen Hyatt gave, I think, the best explanation I'd heard on that when she was talking about how, well, he was just a King Noah, and sometimes you have a King Noah, but the Lord's work still goes forward. I'm like, well, okay, if that's how you want to do it. But to me, it's like, if you can do that, if you can square that circle, then why don't we want you in this church? I would think we would absolutely want you in this church. If you're still able to say, I sustain Dallin H. Oaks as president of the church and a prophet, seer, and revelator, but I think Brigham Young was the worst, so what? To me, that's like, great. Well, I'm glad you're on board, glad you're here. But I think the church is kind of uncomfortable with that, because I think the implications of rejecting Joseph Smith's polygamy, rejecting Section 132, are really theologically indefensible. And Section 132, frankly, is the best explication we have of the doctrine of theosis, the idea that we become like God.
You throw all that out too if you throw out 132.
There's a lot, and when we sing "I am a child of God," you're singing Section 132, whether you realize it or not. All of that comes as part of that, and the sealing power. But trying to sort of carve that out, I again, if someone can do that and they still have faith and they're still going to show up and they're going to shovel snow, for the ward building, why do we want to turn those guys away? That doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah. I have one more comment here. I don't want to keep you too late, but this is off topic but similar. Noel says, can one consider the Book of Abraham non-historical and be accepted as a member? I think it depends on your bishop and your stake president.
It doesn't, actually, or it shouldn't. Yes, if you have a bishop or a stake president that wants to come after you and overstep their stewardship, then it could. There is not a single temple recommend question that asks you about the historicity of the Book of Abraham or the historicity of the Book of Mormon.
And that goes for baptism too, if you were trying to be baptized.
Nothing. That is not a question. And one of the things I love to quote Uncle Howard, who I mentioned before, not Uncle Howard Hunter, but Howard Anderson, president of the Los Angeles State. Whenever he would do a temple recommend interview, he would start, there's a script, and most people in those offices end up memorizing the script, whether they want to or not. I've been in 2 bishoprics. I didn't ever quite memorize the script, but I came pretty close. I didn't have to look down much to ask the questions. But he had his own little script right before, and he'd say, I want you to know that this interview is more about self-reflection on your part than it is about judgment on my part. And that has always stayed with me because I think that's absolutely right. And so when people when I talk to people about temple recommend interview, and it's like, well, can I, what if I'm paying on my gross or not my net, or what if I'm paying only on my increase, or what if I, is green tea against the word of wisdom, and and I said, okay, here's the deal, guys. Here's the deal about your temple recommend interview. And I learned this sort of the hard way. When I was getting married, my wife's parents, we were up in Port Angeles, Washington. And so we had to get interviewed essentially like a temple recommend interview. And the guy conducting this interview was a stake president who had a reputation for being kind of a hardliner. And I went into this interview and they asked all the questions. And one of the questions was, are you honest in all your dealings with your fellow man? They've since changed and softened that question somewhat, but that was the question at the time. And that was the one, when I've been in bishoprics, that was the one that everybody would like, well, I try. I can't be perfect on that, but I'm trying really hard. And so I start to do all of that and say, I'm trying, and to say I'm perfectly honest, I don't know that would be honest of me to say that. And he just sort of stared at me blankly. And then he said, I'll repeat the question. Are you honest in all your dealings with your fellow men? It's a yes or no question. And I went, okay. I mean, he didn't want to hear it. He wanted to hear the yes. It's like, can I proceed with the interview? Because I need a yes, otherwise we're done, and you're done. And so if I can't reconcile answering yes, I shouldn't go into the interview in the first place. So what I tell people is, look, if you're nuanced, I don't really like that word much, but because everybody's more nuanced than they realize. But if you're nuanced and you've got this says the worst time to explore that nuance is in a temple recommend interview. When you walk into the interview, you need to know, what the questions are. You need to know that you can answer them all appropriately and make that decision before you go in. Wrestle with all of your nuance before you go in. Because, as somebody that's been on the other side of the table, as a bishopric counselor, it's like, I can't answer that question for you. I can't tell you if you're honest in all your dealings. You want me really to judge what's an appropriate full tithe? You want me to do that? How about you do that? How about you reflect on that and you make that decision and you be accountable to the Lord for that decision? And if you're committing adultery and you want to go in and lie and say that you're living the law of chastity, well, the Lord's probably going to have some problems with that. But it's not. I'm not going to sit here and conduct an investigation into your. That's not what the temple recommend interview is for. So when people say, "Well, can I be a faithful member of the church and not believe in a historical book of Abraham or not believe?" It's like there isn't a question. There isn't even a question about those things. I don't know. I don't have any idea what other members of my ward think about the book of Abraham. Absolutely no clue. How many of them think it's? I'm sure the bishop doesn't know. And why should he? That's. As long as you're keeping your covenants, as long as you're showing up, as long as you're participating, as long as you're pitching in, this is between you and the Lord. You don't worship the church. You are accountable to the Lord. You worship the Lord. And if you in good conscience want to continue to participate in the church and continue to go to the temple and continue to do all these other things, great, as far as I'm concerned. So,
all right. Well, I was trying to keep this to an hour, and we're 2 hours in, so we probably better wrap it up.
Sorry, I have a big mouth, and I like to talk. Have I
I'm totally fine with it. I feel bad about taking all your time, but I really appreciate it. So, a couple last comments here. Craig Newsom earlier said he did not see that in President Nelson. He agreed with Jesus. He also said he does not agree with excommunication. Pierce Spins, I am a child of God. I'm not sure I understand this. Section Old DNC 101.
That's the one that talked about that condemned polygamy.
Yeah. But then I will also say that Craig Newsom, just as you finished your statement, said amen. So he totally agreed with you on that.
Craig Newsom's the one who said that he didn't see that in President Nelson.
Yeah.
I was not going to imply that President Nelson did not love Jesus. Again, when you accept fallibility, when you start talking about something you disagree with, there kind of is this sort of instinct to say, well, but I'm condemning everything about President Nelson. President Nelson's tenure as president of the church, I think, was remarkable in ways that were more significant than almost any other president of the church in my lifetime. We all expected this sort of doddering old man, and he came in with such vigor and did so many things to reform the church. And I've said this many times too. I consider President Nelson's peacemaker talk to be not just the best talk that President Nelson ever gave, but the best conference talk I have ever heard from anyone in my lifetime. So I'm not trying to denigrate President Nelson. I do think he had a weakness in that he enjoyed adulation a little more than I would have liked him to. But so what? Who cares? So.
All right, and then one last thing here from Ultronverse. Gotta ask Jim real quick if he remembers me because he still follows me on Twitter. I don't know.
I recognize the name. I saw that.
That
I'm like, who's Ultronverse? Yeah, it sounds familiar. I mean, we haven't gone to lunch or anything, but I recognize the name.
You're still on Twitter? Because I just find Twitter a cesspool. I can't even get on there.
It is a cesspool. It is a cesspool.
People think I follow them, and I'm like, I don't even log on.
Well, so I got off Twitter for a while. I had people. There were a couple accounts that were just awful, and one that I sort of struck a deal with.
More than a couple.
There's an account called the Exmo Cringe. They used to be just Exmo Cringe, but they were just talking about me on a daily basis and just trashing me. And then at one point they said, okay, they posted the number of the Tabernacle Choir. And they said, Jim Bennett does not belong in the Tabernacle Choir. Make sure you call the Tabernacle Choir and tell them that Jim Bennett needs to be kicked out. And I called the Tabernacle Choir. I know the woman who answers the phone. There's not a huge phone bank. There's a few people at the front desk, but this is a woman that served in the choir with me, and she you're not allowed to work for the choir and serve in the choir at the same time. So she's had to step down, but she's young enough that I think that she's going to go back into the choir at some other point. Anyway, I call and I say, Allison, has anybody called to ask me to get me kicked out of the choir? And she goes, What are you talking about? No, nobody's called. Why? And I said, well, look at this account. This account is telling everybody to call, and this account, they have 3,000 followers, and they're talking about me on a daily basis, and I'm a terrible progmo, and they want me kicked out of the choir. And she looked at it, and she went, Jim, this is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. She says, do you mind if I escalate this? She says, I'm going to pass this along to church security. And I went, oh, please do. Within 2 hours, the account was suspended.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know who it is at church security, but it was like, but it came back. It's back now. It's got half as many followers as it had before. And I finally went to them. I was sending a message. I said, look, what do I have to do to get you to just leave me alone? I don't just leave me alone. I mean, I'm not attacking you. Just shut up. And they said, well, you blocked so many of my friends on Twitter. What you need to do is unblock all of them. I said, is that the deal? If I just unblock all of your friends, will you shut up? And they said, yeah, sure. Okay, fine. And I went, okay, great. And so I unblocked all of these people. And it was okay for a little while, but then there were like 3 or 4 of them that just took up the baton and were in every single thing I posted. It's like, Jim Bennett, you're an apostate, and how dare you? You're the worst. And most of it's political. Most of them are mad at me because I hate Donald Trump, which to me has absolutely nothing to do with my faithfulness in the church, but they absolutely think it does. And it was just exhausting. And I finally went back to this guy, this Exmo cringe guy, and said, I'm done. I'm done with this. And because, I thought it was going to keep me from being harassed. And I've got like 5 more people who are even worse than you were. So I'm blocking you. I'm blocking them. Goodbye. And this account went nuts for a couple of days, but it's like, I haven't given them enough fodder to be angry. But I have 4.1 thousand Twitter followers. And when I realized,
you don't know them all.
I want people to listen to my podcast. I was like, this is probably the best platform here where people know what I'm doing. And when I post a podcast, so yeah, I'm back on Twitter. My wife would very much like me to get off of Twitter because it's a cesspool. It's an absolute cesspool. But
yeah, I agree.
But whether you like it or not, it's kind of where the conversation is happening. And I had a conversation with a guy who works at church headquarters, not a general authority, but somebody who works in the PR department, and not Aaron Sherinian, who I know fairly well, and that's been part of my big Twitter thing, is that I've gone online to defend Aaron Sherinian. But he said, this guy said, look, when people go online, these are the first people they see are these terrible, terrible church members. And they think we're all polygamists, but they think we're all racists. They think we're all gun nuts that live in the mountains with the Bundys. The church just doesn't know what to do with these guys. And they think that they're being these absolute wonderful defenders of the faith, and they're just doing nothing but damage to the reputation of the church. And the highlight for that, fairly recently, church announced just a few days ago, that there was a new branch in Idaho, in Boise, Idaho, that was all Swahili speaking. There had been a number of African refugees that had settled in Boise, and they finally created a branch. And it's a ward, actually, and it's the first Swahili speaking ward in the United States.
Wow.
And I commented and said, wonderful, so glad to see this. My comments were outnumbered 20-1 by just the most vile racists you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
The N-word was used. It was just vicious and awful. And I just, it's like, we cede this space to these people. That's who people think the church is. And in my experience, up close and personal, that's who the church is. But online, that's absolutely what the church is. And that's really frightening to me.
I think you should join Blue Sky.
I'm on Blue Sky.
Oh, you are? Okay.
I'm on Blue Sky.
I don't spend a lot of time on Blue Sky either. I got an account.
The conversation isn't happening on Blue Sky.
Yeah. But it's better.
It is 100 times better. You kidding? Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I know it's getting late. And Jim, we might have to do this again sometime.
Well, if you'll have me back, I had a great time. So I didn't wear out my welcome by just not shutting up. But that's the thing I've had to learn on my own podcast. It's like when the guest comes on, I hope the guest will talk.
Well, you're the guest, so you're supposed to do all the talking here.
So I don't think I'm in as much trouble as if I had done this on my own podcast. I confess that I have done this on my own podcast far too many times. So.
All right. Well, I'll have you hang on just a second, but I'm going to let everybody go. It's great having you all here at LDS Faith Journeys and Gospel Tangents. I keep trying to figure out how to get this to go on my LDS Faith Journeys account, but it's still on Gospel Tangents because I can't. There's a tech issue.
Does this go up on Wheat and Tares blog?
Well, I'm going to probably post this tomorrow, except for I'm going to have to stay up late to get the post up. But yeah, I'm probably going to do a kind of a little thing and a link to that. So maybe I'll fix the sound at the beginning if I can.
Fan.
Oh, good.
That's good.
We should get you to guest post on there. Would you like to do that sometime? I can arrange that.
I just posted on there 2 or 3 times.
Okay. Well, let me know. I'll be happy to help you out there.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Well, Jim Bennett from Inside and Out, I really appreciate you for being here on LDS Faith Journeys and Gospel Tangents, and we'll see you around.
Looking forward to it.
If you'd like to hear the entire conversation without any interruptions, sign up at patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire video or audio uncut, whichever you'd like. So this is part of the Gospel Tangents podcast network, and so please sign up today and support Gospel Tangents.